We all know that Tony Ferguson has hit a rough patch in his career, to put it lightly. The disastrous 6-fight losing streak he has been on since 2020 is among the worst in UFC history, only being surpassed by infamous losing streaks like that of BJ Penn and Sam Alvey. This change in Ferguson's career trajectory is made even more notable because of how rapid and thorough it has been. In 2020, Tony was on a 12-fight win streak and primed for a title shot. Now he's on a 6-fight skid and he's been finished 4 times. Prior to the Justin Gaethje fight, even mentioning Tony Ferguson in the same breath as Sam Alvey would seem ludicrous. But you probably didn't even bat an eye when I did it a moment ago. That's how bad the situation has gotten. The worrying thing is that it seems like it could possibly get even worse, and I believe that some red flags are going unnoticed by a lot of MMA fans. When looking back at Tony's losing streak, the elephant in the room is obviously the Justin Gaethje fight. While I don't believe that a 39-year-old Tony would look like a prime version of himself if that fight never happened, it's undeniable that this was a turning point in his career. There is pre-Gaethje Ferguson and post-Gaethje Ferguson, and the latter is a shadow of the former. This was a career-altering beating, and the notion that Justin beat the prime out of Tony seems to ring more true with every new loss. What I think goes a bit unremarked upon when people discuss this fight is the consequence of Tony cutting weight twice. For some reason, a lot of fans have forgotten this, but during the chaos of what was the reshuffling of UFC 249, Tony decided to prove some kind of point that only Tony could understand, by cutting down to 155 on what was the initial date of the event. He went through a 24-pound weight cut in 1 week, then 3 weeks later went through the same process for the Gaethje fight. It's impossible to say exactly what impact this had on his performance, but there's no way that it was positive. Weight cutting usually isn't just a matter of dehydrating yourself. For elite fighters, it's a process that will take weeks and involves dieting down to a certain weight from which you then make the water cut. Much like every other aspect of a fighter's preparation, this is intended to put them as close as possible to their peak on fight night. That said, the process of cutting weight, of being in a caloric deficit for weeks while training hard and then dehydrating yourself, undeniably depletes the body. And Tony went through that depleting process unnecessarily an extra time. With the way weight cutting works, Tony would not have been able to truly recover from the effects of that first weight cut within the following 3 weeks, as he would have had to keep his weight within the range of his water cut, which for Tony we know is about 180 pounds. So realistically, Tony probably spent 6 to 8 weeks in a depleted state prior to the Gaethje fight. This just isn't good for your body. Preparing for a fight is already basically redlining your body, and that is without adding an unnecessary extra weight cut, but it arguably gets even worse. We know for a fact that weight cutting affects the brain, and that has been linked to an increased risk of traumatic brain injuries among combat sports athletes. It's unclear what going through this process twice in 3 weeks would do to Tony, but again, it couldn't have been positive. The best case scenario is that nothing happened, but it's possible that Tony went into that fight impaired. Then he took a career-altering degree of punishment at an age when most fighters start to decline anyway. It's possible that Tony's decision to cut weight twice in the lead up to the Gaethje fight might have been one of the single worst decisions any fighter has ever made. While the Gaethje fight was likely the tipping point that started Tony's decline, his fighting style was always a house of cards just waiting to be knocked over. Tony was a very, very good fighter, one of the best in history in fact, but he had some massive flaws in his game. He was just able to get away with them for a long period of time because of his outstanding physical attributes. There have been moments in the past where we've seen those holes exposed though. You can go all the way back to his loss to Michael Johnson in 2012. Fans often attribute this win to one of Johnson's odd moments of greatness, but I think it was part of a pattern we've seen with Tony a few times prior to his recent decline. Fighters that were faster or more athletic than Tony could exploit the holes in his fighting style. We saw an even more dramatic example of this when Lando Venata nearly finished Tony in the first round of their fight. Lando isn't a scrub, but the high watermark of his career is arguably going life and death with Tony in a losing effort. He was able to do this because he had a noticeable speed advantage, and he was able to exploit some of the gaps in Ferguson's striking. A similar scenario played out in Tony's fight with Anthony Pettis, who is one of the most athletic and dynamic fighters in MMA history. Pettis was able to drop Tony and hurt him bad enough that Ferguson was forced to roll out of danger like Jonathan Ivey fighting a 257-year-old Ken Shamrock. But as in the Venata fight, Tony's durability and freakish endurance carried him through, until it was called off when Pettis broke his hand. Outside of a few flashes here and there, Tony's athleticism has waned considerably post-Gaethje. This has allowed his opponents to exploit the weaknesses that were always there: the poor striking fundamentals, the hitability, and the unremarkable takedown defense. And to make matters worse, Tony's durability seems to be finally failing him. That front kick from Michael Chandler probably knocks out 99.9% of all lightweights, but pre-Gaethje Tony is one of the few people I think could have survived it, and possibly even come back from it to win the fight. That guy doesn't exist anymore. It was literally beaten out of him. Against Nate Diaz, he looked gun-shy throughout a lot of that fight, before ultimately succumbing to the guillotine choke. And in the fight with Bobby Green, well, he looked washed. That fight wasn't as brutal as the Gaethje fight, but for every strike Tony landed, he ate 2.5 in return, mostly by walking chin first into punches. If I'm being honest, he resembled somebody doing an impression of Tony Ferguson, more so than the guy who was once on a 12-fight win streak. He was painfully slow compared to his past self. Even his classic rolls and spinning attacks looked labored, like he was rolling around in molasses. Green had no trouble getting out of the way of them and even used one of those attempts as a way to set up the fight-ending sequence. It's one thing to get dominated on the ground by Charles Oliveira or Beneil Dariush. They are two of the best grapplers in the UFC. Oliveira has more submissions than anyone in the history of the promotion, and it's not even close. And he still couldn't sub Tony. But Bobby Green, he has one other win by submission in his UFC career. It was against Jacob Volkman back in 2013. Again, Bobby Green isn't a bad fighter. Far from it, actually. But if I told you in April of 2020 that Bobby Green would choke Ferguson unconscious, you would probably think I was crazy. In fact, I would say that the difference between surviving against Oliveira and getting choked out by Bobby Green may be one of the most stark indicators of how far Tony has fallen. A little over 3 years ago, it was almost inconceivable that Tony could lose to anyone not named Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now it's hard to imagine that he could beat anyone ranked in the top 20 at lightweight. If you think I'm being dramatic, I want you to take a moment and think about who you would be genuinely confident in Tony beating. If they match Tony up against Paddy Pimblett, do you see Tony winning that fight more than 50% of the time? I'm skeptical. That brings me to my next point. What is next for Tony? After losing to Bobby Green, Ferguson said on Instagram that he plans to work closely with Dana, Hunter, and his entire team to assess what's next. Realistically, what can the UFC do with him? Perhaps even more importantly, what do they want to do with him? With Tony being the fan favorite that he is, I could see them offering him one of those extremely rare opportunities, as they recently did with Robbie Lawler. One more chance in an exciting matchup against a beatable opponent, and we're going to celebrate your legacy. But it's your retirement fight. Of course, it's anybody's guess if Tony would accept that offer, or if the UFC would even extend it to him. They may just match him up against a tough and lesser-known guy like Benoit Saint-Denis. I don't think there is any appetite for that, but you could probably count on one hand the number of times that has made a difference. Tony has recently come out and said he's not retiring, and there has been some chatter between him and Conor McGregor as of late. Maybe that fight happens, but again, I'm skeptical. We really have no idea what is going on with Conor. It's anybody's guess at this point. That being said, Conor might be one of the only winnable fights for Tony. He's a 35-year-old whiskey salesman coming off a gruesome injury and a 2-year hiatus full of hard living. I'd be shocked if he resembled anything close to the Conor of old. Regardless, the future is currently very uncertain, and consequently a lot more worrisome. In the event that Tony loses another fight and/or gets cut from the UFC, what happens then? On one hand, Tony Ferguson is the type of guy that I could see just packing it up and retiring. On the other hand, I could see him fighting until the bitter end. I find that possibility more likely, to be honest. If the Bobby Green fight is any indication of the direction Tony is heading long term, it doesn't look good. He's not just slower, less durable, or technically flawed. It seems like he has finally reached that point of no return where the body just isn't capable of responding the way it used to. This is where I start to get concerned. If Tony is unwilling or unable to realize it's time to step away from the sport, we could really be heading for some dark times. Tony wouldn't be the first fighter to go down this road. It's a tale as old as time. It's hard for fighters in general to know when to hang them up. There are few things in this world that compare to fighting another person in front of thousands of adoring fans. For a lot of fighters, it becomes the defining aspect of their identity. It's all they've known. They've spent most of their life doing it. It's the thing they're truly good at. And let's just be honest, for a lot of them, it's also the best, if not the only way for them to make a sustainable living. Then one day, they just can't do it anymore. Their body has broken down. That's the reason so many stick around long after they should have quit. Also, as Josh Thompson pointed out in a recent emotional plea to Tony, he might still be chasing something. He never got that undisputed title shot, or the fight with Khabib. It's gotta be hard to think about retiring when you feel like you have unfinished business. But even if Tony does make the tough decision to retire in the near future, I'm not sure if that makes the situation any less concerning. Tony is an eccentric guy, to say the least. But it's not all champ shit only blades and shades, metal pipe kicking hilariousness though. He's already had one full-blown delusional episode, as well as a history of mental health problems. When this is brought up, it's often done in a somewhat joking manner, with people making comments about Tony spending too much time with Eddie Bravo, or something of that nature. The truth is a lot more disturbing, and it's largely been swept under the rug by the MMA community. In March of 2019, Ferguson's wife, Christina, filed for a temporary restraining order after police were called 5 separate times dating back to January of 2018. Although Tony was not reported to have been violent on any of those occasions, his behavior was still very alarming. In the documents for a court filing obtained by MMAfighting.com, Mrs. Ferguson made several claims that provided more details on the events leading up to her decision to pursue a restraining order. Christina claimed that on February 5th, Tony didn't sleep because he believed there would be a great flood as a result of a lunar eclipse. Tony allegedly purchased a life raft and drove Christina and their son to Palm Desert, California, about 111 miles inland from their house. At this new location, she said Tony woke her and their son up in the middle of the night and said that they had to leave because they were not safe. She added that Tony promised to seek help for his mental issues if there was no flood, but later refused. On the 12th, Tony had what she described as a psychotic break or panic attack, where he screamed and swore at her and believed she was someone else. She later woke up that night to Tony standing over her and accusing her of being a witch. On the 16th, Tony unplugged the refrigerator and turned off half the power in their house because he believed there were cameras in the refrigerator and ceiling fan and that he was being watched. He then cut the wires to the heat and air conditioning units because he believed there was a tracking device in them, and he allegedly tore the vanity mirror off the bathroom wall because he believed there was something behind it. He also took his son's food away because he believed it was poisoned. 3 days later, Tony allegedly agreed to be taken for psychological help at Keck Medical Center at USC. Christina and her father went to pick him up, but when they arrived, they found much of the house destroyed. According to Christina, Tony had ripped the mantle off the wall because he believed there was a hidden doorway under the fireplace. Around this time, Christina moved into her parents' house. On March 5th, Christina once again picked Tony up to take him to the hospital. While they were driving on the freeway, they hit traffic, at which point Tony jumped out of the moving vehicle onto the freeway, jumped over a fence John Jones style, before disappearing, though he did later make it back to their house. The final straw came on March 7th. Earlier that day, Christina said that Tony had been acting irrationally. He asked her whose car was parked outside their house and questioned if she was withdrawing money from their joint bank accounts to take their son to Italy. For the record, Christina said she is not Italian and doesn't know anybody in Italy. Later that day, Tony arrived at her parents' house where Christina was staying and allegedly asked their son if he wanted to go for a ride. Christina told Tony it was too late and he couldn't take their son. She and her mother then stood in front of Tony to prevent him from leaving, but he pushed them both out of the way. Then he ran back into the house and out the back door and over a fence with his son in his arms. Tony had also left his cell phone and his car behind when he ran off on foot. And to make matters worse, their son was not wearing shoes or a diaper when Tony took him, and it was raining at the time. According to Christina, she was terrified for the safety of their son. And if you listen to the 911 call she made in the wake of Tony fleeing with the child, the fear in her voice is evident, not just for her son, but also for the police officers who might end up engaging with Tony.
I actually left the location with my son because I was not comfortable with it anymore. Okay. He is a professional fighter.
Okay, and is he there by himself or is there anyone else there?
No, he's there by himself, just the dogs. but he's there by himself.
And it's your husband?
Yeah, it's my husband.
What's
so that's
his
what I'm
name?
saying. I just want to let you guys know he's a professional fighter because, one, I don't want no cop to get injured or anything.
we don't.
If you just send one.
No, we don't want anyone to get hurt. What's your husband's name?
Tony Ferguson.
To be honest, I think the fact that Tony's wife was concerned for the safety of the police says quite a lot about Tony's mental state at the time, and what she thought he might have been capable of. Additionally, Christina stated she believed that the March 7th incident was the culmination of a series of mental breaks Tony had been having over the previous month, where he allegedly had increased delusions and paranoia. Specifically, she claimed that Tony believed that their son was Jesus Christ, and that Tony was the second Jesus Christ. How that works, I'm not entirely sure. She also wrote in her declaration that Tony asked their son if he was possessed or overtaken by other beings, which obviously frightened the child. I think it's also worth noting that in one of the police reports filed when they were called to the Ferguson residence, Tony's wife said that he was throwing holy water at her. Holy water in quotations here. And it's something she even brought up during the 911 call.
Did he hurt you or your children?
No.
No, you're okay.
Doing really just random stuff, like he puts holy water on me. I don't know what's going on with him.
Are you?
While not a major aspect of the story, it's a peculiar through line that kind of ties everything together, and Tony getting all Jesus-y might be a red flag to watch for in the future. After Christina filed for the restraining order on the 13th, officers went to Tony's residence to remove the child. In a welfare check, it was noted that the child appeared well taken care of, and Tony let the child go with his mother of his own free will. Although these were the events that specifically led Mrs. Ferguson to file for the restraining order, she detailed several other instances of disturbing behavior dating back to 2011. One of these mental breaks allegedly occurred after Tony won the Ultimate Fighter. While attempting to fly back to Michigan to visit his parents, Tony had some kind of outburst and was removed from the plane. Subsequently, he visited the hospital, where he was prescribed risperidone, an antipsychotic used to treat schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Things improved after this, until 2017, when she claimed that Tony's unstable behavior began to surface. Christina wrote that he had begun to think she was evil and would not let her shower or be in the bathroom alone. She also linked the changes to a period of heavy drinking. If you're familiar with Tony's time on The Ultimate Fighter, this isn't that surprising. For some time, he was known and frankly disliked by many fans due to a drunken altercation he had in the Tough House with Charlie Rader, where he repeatedly taunted Rader about losing custody of his child. Christina chose not to file for divorce because she believed that Tony was in need of mental help. Instead, she requested full custody of their son, citing fear that Tony would flee with the child. She asked that Tony undergo a 52-week batterer intervention program and undergo a psychiatric evaluation and follow any and all prescribed course of treatment and medication. After the hearing, Christina would release a statement through her lawyer, saying, quote, "Tony Ferguson is a good husband and a good father to our son. The current legal proceedings are a part of a process to ensure that Tony will receive the help necessary to continue being the best possible, as well as to pursue his passion and career as a UFC champion fighter." End quote. On the 16th, Tony addressed the situation on Instagram, thanking his fans for their support and kind words, as well as saying that he was working with the UFC and his management to get him the help he needed. Ultimately, Christina Ferguson would drop the restraining order case, but the reasons for that remain uncertain. Now, after going over all of this, I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to demonize Tony for a period in his life where he struggled with his mental health. It happens to a lot of people. That said, it has become concerning in light of some recent events. In May of this year, Tony was arrested for suspicion of DUI in Hollywood, after hitting several other vehicles and rolling his truck. According to the officers on scene, he was uncooperative, smelled of alcohol, and refused to take a breathalyzer test. It should also be noted that there were 2 other occupants in Tony's vehicle, and Los Angeles' KTLA TV News reported that one person was transported to the hospital in unknown condition. Tony has since pled not guilty to the misdemeanor DUI charges, and claimed in the lead up to UFC 291 that the report of his incident was a lot of slander, though he didn't really elaborate on what he meant by that.
Well, I'm going to be real with you. There's a whole bunch of slander and a whole bunch of shit that probably shouldn't have been down, but you know what I mean? There's going to be some lawsuits and some other shit that's going down, so you guys really want to get into it. I've always taken heat from the media. I've always taken heat from the media, and now I'm telling you guys, which is funny, you want to laugh about it, which is kind of cool, but you guys weren't there. I was there. So I know what the fuck's going on. I pay attention to what I fucking had to do, and I'm gonna be real with you. I'm here at UFC 291 because I asked for this fight. Now, I never really asked for fights because I'm always just getting handed shit, or I'm always getting handed shit.
In isolation, Tony getting a DUI would be a concerning development because he's clearly at a crossroads in his career, and that can put a serious mental strain on someone. But when you factor in Tony's history with alcohol and the connections to his mental episodes, the situation becomes alarming. Then we have Tony's comments before UFC 291. In the lead up to the Bobby Green fight, Tony talked about having to fire toxic coaches.
Took a full pandemic for me to lose my 12-fight win streak. Not angry at it, but I had to fire some coaches. I had to fire some people because I was trying to get them back, and they weren't good for me. It was toxic. It was toxic to me, and I didn't realize it, how much I was looking forward to that.
As well as saying that he felt like he was finally hitting his prime.
It's been cool. And then I feel at this point in time in my life that I'm just barely hitting my prime, which is crazy.
Prior to the Bobby Green fight, you could just chalk this up to Tony saying Tony things. I mean, he did spend like half of this scrum talking about how he tracked a bear around his property.
When you say you're tracking a bear, were you out there like with weapons or anything? Or are you just out there hands and feet and...
It's blades and shades. I don't fuck around.
In hindsight, after seeing how bad he looked against Bobby Green, it comes off as fucking delusional. Tony has always had a Diego Sanchez-esque view of the world, but this feels different. It just doesn't even remotely line up with reality anymore. That's not a good sign. Of course, I'm not saying anything will happen with Tony. It's impossible to predict that. But if something were to happen, we will look back at these red flags and say, how did we not see it coming? It's a bit like predicting the weather. We can't say that a hurricane will form in a certain place at a certain time, but we can say that the right conditions are in place for it to happen. With Tony, all of those conditions are there. If it were just one problem or another, it wouldn't be that much to worry about, but it's everything. He's a fighter on a historic losing streak who has taken a frankly disturbing amount of punishment in his career. He doesn't seem inclined to retire, and he's probably going to keep fighting until the wheels completely fall off, if we haven't already hit that point. And he doesn't appear to recognize or even want to acknowledge that they're falling off. Tony has a history of legitimately crazy behavior, exacerbated by alcohol, and it looks like he currently might not have a handle on his drinking. When you combine all of this together, it feels like Tony is a ticking time bomb. Again, maybe nothing will happen, but all of the conditions are in place for something truly catastrophic to occur, if Tony doesn't have the right people looking out for him. Considering he recently fired his toxic coaches, that's entirely up for debate. I'm not trying to be hyperbolic or fearmonger here. I'm just looking at the facts that a lot of people don't want to acknowledge or engage with. The situation we're watching unfold is very precarious, and it has the potential to end very badly. Unfortunately, I don't know what the answer is. If a fighter wants to keep fighting, there isn't much that can be done about it, short of a commission intervening or a promoter refusing to sign them. That said, as long as a fighter can pass whatever half-assed medical exams the commission puts them through, it's very unlikely that they will be refused a license. And there is always a promoter out there ghoulish enough to sign a fighter, regardless of how washed they are. Diego Sanchez somehow being allowed to box a professional boxer in BKFC is an example of both of those problems. Tony is at a pivotal point in his career, and more importantly, his life. He's walking on a razor's edge at the moment, and the choices he will make, even in the short term, are likely to have massive and long-lasting impacts. It really does only take one bad loss to completely change everything. And arguably, we've seen that happen to Tony once already. I don't know if he could sustain that happening again. Hopefully, Tony does still have some people around him that can deliver the hard message, and hopefully he is able to listen to them when that time comes. For now, it seems like all we can do is wait and hope that the worst does not actually come to pass. As always, I want to thank you for watching the video, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing. This was just a little something different. I've had some thoughts rattling around my head about Tony lately, and I wanted to try expressing them without going into a crazy deep dive into his career. And this might be something I pursue occasionally in the future. I'd also like to give a special thank you to my supporters on Patreon who help make these videos possible. Thank you. Hingle McCringleberry, Farm D, Brady, Jonas Namenson, Rusty Shackelford, Jackson, Fightback CBD, Mike Roballs, Bone CK, Fisherman 666, Laziest Man on Mars, Skunk Ape, Missy Muscles, Random Candor, Fuzi Eunice, Dot Old Neon, Timothy Lee Peterson, Julius Caesar Has Jungle Fever, Ellie, Firebrand, Quasi, Snepsts, I Said No Cops, Alex, and Neem.